Before we start on our next lab, let's go over these HSRP states. We've seen a couple of them, especially standby and active, but let's go through them in order. Disabled is officially the first HSRP port state. It's very similar to STP in that you won't actually see it mentioned. You won't see, HSRP disabled in a console message, but it is the first official port state. Now, initial or init, the interface enters this state when you first enable HSRP on it. HSRP isn't actually running at this point. The only other time I've ever seen that, it's in a lab environment, thankfully. If you went in, let's say right now on one of the routers and deleted interface VLAN 100, you would see the HSRP state go from active or standby, depending on which one you're on. If you're on the active, it would go from active to init, and then it would just sit there. Which is not what we want. Now listen, that's the next state, and that's when the router knows the virtual router's IP address, but it is not yet the primary or a standby, and it's listening for hello packets from those routers. In speak state, the router is now speaking, it is sending hello messages, and it's participating in the election of the primary and standby. Standby, we've seen that a couple of times. The router is a candidate to become the active. It continues to send hello packets, and then finally active, the router is now forwarding packets sent to that group's virtual IP address. Speaking of forwarding packets sent to the group's virtual IP address, let's talk about load balancing here for a bit and see it in action as well. Now, I have reset things from the previous lab as far as the priorities go, so right now everything is back at the default, and switch 2 is the active router for our group. Switch 1, of course, is just standing by and watching MLS 2 do all the work. Now, assuming that we had 60 hosts in VLAN 100, that means that right now switch 2 is handling the traffic for 60 hosts, and our other multi-layer switch 1 is just standing by watching. We would like to do a little bit of balancing here. Now, this balancing is going to be a little bit different because it does require a little bit of cooperation from the hosts. And we'll talk about that after we get the switches up and running, because I guess tricking may be a harsh way to put it, but we're kind of tricking HSRP a little bit here as far as I'm concerned, because what we're going to do is create another group. Right now, HSRP group 5, it has switch 2 as the active router, and that group is using 172.16.23.12 to represent its virtual router. What we're going to do now is create group 10 with the same 2 routers. There's nothing illegal about that yet. We'll find out in a minute, I guess. Making sure that 1 is the active, switch 1 is the active, and that group will use another address, 172.16.23.21, for its virtual router. So this is what we want to end up with, in essence. We want to split this load. It's not pure load balancing, of course, because we could have some hosts sending a lot more traffic. But the thing is, it's better than what we had. So in the end, we want switch 2 to remain the active for group 5, but be the standby for group 10. We want the inverse, really, for switch 1. We want switch 1 to be the active for group 10, but the standby for group 5. Okay, so we're already halfway there because we know that switch 2 is the active for group 5. And let me move that up. And we can just verify right here, of course, before we start a lab. Show standby, VLAN 100 group 5. State is active. So let's go ahead and create another group. And we're going to start that over on switch 1. And we just go right back under VLAN 100. But this time, of course, we're using standby 10. That's our new group. 172.16.23.21. That's going to be the IP of the virtual. Standby 10. We're going to go ahead and double the priority again, and we're going to let this one preempt. And that's all we need there. We need even less over on MLS 2. Move that. And let's try that again. VLAN 100. Just came right back. Standby 10, IP 172.16.23.21. And that's it. So we're going to let that cook for a minute here and see how it goes. Actually, let's go over to 1 and see what it's saying already with show standby. And when you run show standby there by itself, it's going to give you the info on all the groups. And you can see that it's still the standby for group 5. but switch 1 is now the active for group 10. Now it says standby router is unknown, so it's not done yet, but let's go ahead and run it again now. And you can see that we get exactly what we wanted. Group 10, switch 1 is active. There's the IP address. There's the MAC address. Notice the 0A at the end of it. Remember I told you a group 10 would be 0A there because it's hex. There you go. Preemption's enabled. Active router is local. Standby router is 172.16.23.2. So that's exactly what we wanted. Let's go over to switch 2 just for fun. And we can see that in group 5, this switch is the active router. Active router is local. Standby is 23.1. And for group 10, the story is a little bit different. Group 10, let's try that again, group 10, and we've got active router is switch 1, 23.1, and the standby router is local. So that's all there is to load balancing. Again, it's not absolutely perfect, but it's really, really good. And here is essentially what we have now. We're going to test this in a moment, because remember I said something about the hosts? We're not quite done with our load balancing until we give about half of our hosts one of the virtual router IP addresses for a default gateway. Then we give the other half of the hosts the other virtual router's IP address as a default gateway. That's the way you got to split it up. So you can see here, just using 2 hosts, we've got host 2 with its default gateway pointing to 172.16.23.21, and that's the path it's going to take. And then host 3 is has a different default gateway. It has the other router's, virtual router's IP address 23.12 set as the default. So let's go ahead and send some pings there and just make absolutely sure. Let's see if we can get that up there to stay this time. And we've got 2. We're going to head out to router 2 and do a 172.16.23.21. No problem there with it pinging its virtual, its default gateway, which is a virtual router IP address. Now host 3, we're going to ping the other one. And all is well. So that's really the key, is that you just have to remember that you're not quite done with your load balancing when you get that second virtual router up and running. You are done with it when you go to your hosts and you change some of their default gateways, half of them pointing to one, half of them pointing to another, and you're all set. That is it for load balancing. Now next up, we've got something called interface tracking. It is an absolutely fantastic feature you're very liable to run into in the real world, and you're definitely going to see it on your exam. So let's head to the next video and we'll run that lab.